All right, so this week's Torah portion is VaYelech. It's very short. It's all of one chapter, and it's one short chapter. It's chapter 31, and it's a total of 30 verses. And there's actually quite a lot to say about these 30 verses. So I hope I get through everything I want to say about it because it's quite dense, okay? So we start the Torah portion. The Torah portion is named for the first word, VaYelech. VaYelech means, and he went, and it's talking about Moses. Moses went. And if you look at the first few verses, the first, I would say 8 verses in particular of this Torah portion, there is a lot of verbs that talk about going, walking, going, passing. And it becomes a sort of theme of this first section of the Torah portion. And I just want to point out some of these, and I think we can draw some very nice conclusions. So if we look at verse 1, Moses is going. Okay, Moses went and he spoke these things to Israel. This is, again, if you look at the structure of the rest of Deuteronomy, this is the last Torah portion that has straight prose instruction. It's almost like the last few things Moses is tying up before he dies. Chapter 32 is a poem, is a song that Moses recites to the nation with very important messages, but it's not prose, it's poetry. Okay, and then we have chapter 33, where Moses blesses the nation. And again, this is more in a poetic form than in prose. And then chapter 34, we have Moses' death. So this Torah portion is the last tying up of some of the bits and pieces before we get to these final poems that Moses recites before the nation. Okay, and what does he talk about here? He says, okay, in verse 2, I am now 120 years old. I can no longer, and here some of the translations are probably not very good. It says, I can no longer go out and come in. That's the literal word. Latzeit v'lavo, to go out and come back in. Okay, now that is the literal translation of those words, but those words you also have come to mean in the recent chapters and recent books that we've studied here, have come to mean specifically going out to war, going out and then coming back from war. And we saw that, for example, in Numbers verse 27, as chapter 27, verse 17. That's Numbers 27, verse 17, where Moses is requesting from God that he appoint a leader who will replace him when he defines what that leader needs to do. One of the first things he says, somebody who will go out before them and it will come in before them. And the reference here is clear to someone who will lead them in battle, who will take them out into battle and then bring them back after battle. So you have that idea here too, that Moses is referring to, I am old, I can no longer lead them in battle. And God said to me, you shall not cross over to this Jordan. So again, we're having leading in battle, or going out, coming in, crossing over. And then in verse 3, we have here, the Lord your God, he will pass before you. And it's actually the very same verb that is used to cross the Jordan. So you could say he will pass before you, or he will cross before you. Okay. And it is in the context of war as well, because here it's talking about going into the land and destroying the nations and taking it over. And then it says, and Joshua will pass or cross before you. And that's very interesting because we have the identical verbs and the identical words, pass before you, in the same verse, one referring to God and one referring to Joshua. So it's as if Joshua and God are in a partnership together, crossing before the nation, taking them into the land. And then we have in verse 6, the Lord your God, he is the one who goes before you. In verse 7, now Moses is talking to Joshua and he's telling him, what he's going to do. And he says in verse 8, and God, he is the one who will go before you. Verse 7 first, he says, you're going to go with this nation. You're going to enter with this nation into the land. And here it uses the word go, let's say lavo. Here it's lavo. to pass, to come back, whatever. You see these words happening over and over again. And in this section, of course, Moses is handing over his responsibilities to Joshua, not his spiritual responsibilities, but the physical responsibilities, the actual leadership of the nation and leading them into the land, leading them into war. And it's very interesting, I think, that we have this partnership. Both God and Joshua are leading the nation. And at the same time, when Moses speaks to Joshua, he says, you will be leading the nation, but don't worry because God will be going with you. And I think here, there's a very powerful message. Number one, a message to the leader. Don't worry. You may be the leader, but God is with you. So you can have confidence. You can feel secure that God will be with you. But I think in verse 3, when we have this parallel, God will pass before you or cross before you. Joshua will cross before you. I think what that is meaning is that just because God is crossing before you doesn't mean that you, a human being, Joshua, have a right to stand down and not get involved. Okay? The leadership of God does not negate the leadership of man. And I think that's a very, very important message, because, and it's a message I think that's very prevalent in Judaism. You know, there are a lot of people that say, okay, God's in charge, so we don't have to do anything. We just need to sit back and let God run the show, okay? And while this is a very important statement of faith and trust in God, it is incorrect. Because as you can see here, Joshua has a very important role. Joshua's role was not to sit back and just kind of say, okay, guys, let's take a look. God's going to do his thing. Joshua had a very important role as the physical leader of the nation. And so it is not for the leader to abdicate responsibility just because God is going to be helping out. It is the leader has to still lead and do his job and take his responsibilities. But at the same time, he can trust in the fact that God is alongside him and God is helping him out. So that's the message I take from the beginning. Okay, then I want to skip the next session for a second. Well, no, actually, we'll be coming back to it. The next issue here is really about writing. Okay, Moses is going to be talking about writing two different things. If we look first in verse 9, Moses wrote down this Torah. That's the word that's used here. This is the Torah, the Bible, the teaching, the 5 books of Moses. Okay, this is what it means. He wrote this Torah. He gave it to the priests, sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the Lord's covenant, and to all the elders of Israel. So we have this idea that he wrote something down, okay? And he wrote it down and he presented it. He presented it to the nation, okay? Then we have a break. We have this other thing starting in verse 10 that we're going to come back to. And then we have, starting in verse 16, God says to Moses, you should only know, okay, after you die, the nation's going to get into a whole bunch of trouble, okay? And he says in verse 18, he says, and I will keep my countenance hidden on that day because of all the evil they have done in turning to other gods. So God is going to say there's going to be great sinning in the nation, and God's response is going to hide his face from the nation, okay? And therefore, he gives Moses now an instruction, right in verse 19, write down this poem and teach it to the children of Israel. They should put it in their mouths in order that this poem would be a witness to the children of Israel, okay? Or witness of the children of Israel. It's not exactly clear what is meant there. So, whereas in verse 9, we have Moses writing down the Torah, in verse 19, he's writing down a poem. And indeed, there are two different things that are being written. The poem that is referred to in verse 19 is actually chapter 32. because at the very end of chapter 31, we see then Moses recited the words of this poem to the very end in the hearing of the whole congregation of Israel. And then you can say, chapter 32, this is the poem, okay? But we have two different things going on. And essentially, these two types of writings are being given to the nation as some kind of safeguard or some kind of aid that they will need as they go into the land of Israel, and specifically to help them in some way as they will surely sin, okay? And we have this theme. Okay, so let's first explore the poetry one, okay? The poetry one, we see starting in verse 19 to 22, it says here, and this is God speaking to Moses, okay? He says, because I'm going to bring them to the land, milk and honey, and they're going to find all kinds of problems, and they're going to start worshiping gods. And what do we see in verse 21? This poem shall confront them as a witness, or respond to them as a witness, since it will never be lost from the mouth of their offspring. For I know what plans they're devising even now, before I bring them into the land that I promised on oath. Okay? And so basically, this poem is supposed to be something that Moses is giving to the nation of Israel to teach them. And it says in verse 22, and Moses wrote down this poem and taught it to the Israelites, taught it to the children of Israel. Okay, now, first of all, this idea of God hiding his face, we see it actually mentioned in the poem itself. In chapter 32, verse 20, God says, I will hide my countenance from them and see how they fare in the end, for they are a treacherous breed. When God hides himself or his face or his countenance from us, what he is basically doing is he fails to protect us. He leaves us to whatever happens, to our fate. And this is very interesting because there's, for example, when we look at the curses, we read that two weeks ago. We have all these blessings and curses. So when you look at the curses, is a series of, if you do all these bad things, then all these curses are going to happen to you. And the question is, does God bring the plague upon them? Does God bring the enemies upon them? Or does God just lift his hands and let the world run itself with no interference? And that could be really what the punishment is about, because it is the way of the world for empires to cast their eyes upon some nation. And if they think that they can conquer that nation, they will. It is the way of the world that plagues and famines come from time to time. So it's very possible that it's not so much that God is actually bringing these punishments, but he's allowing nature to take its course without interfering, without protecting the nation from the enemies, or without holding back a plague or an epidemic that would normally come. Okay, and that's one way of saying it. But certainly when we see the idea of God hiding his face, that's really what we're talking about. God is not getting involved. Now, he may sometimes get involved behind the scenes. We won't see it. We don't see this comfort of God coming to us in a very clear way. And that's probably the ultimate punishment. If we want to talk about, we want to feel God is with us. We want to feel God's presence. We want to feel that God is helping us, that he's answering our prayers. Complete silence and non-interference from God is a very terrible thing. And that is what God is saying will happen. And therefore, through those times where God has hidden his face, he is giving us a song. He's giving us this poem that we can read from. So in a way, we, on the one hand, may say, we're not hearing from God. Well, we may not be seeing overt miracles, and we may be suffering, but God has given us his word written down that we can continue to read it and hold it with us. And we will see when we discuss the poem next week that this poem is really kind of a summary of Jewish history on the one hand, and bringing them forward into some of the lessons and important messages that they need to take with them. So as God is going to hide his face, and yet at the same time, he's going to give us this poem to help us. And I found very interesting when it says that Moses taught this to the children of Israel. as a child at school, we learned this chapter 32 by heart. And they took that to be an interpretation of the same way Moses taught this to the children of Israel. He lay it on their hearts. We need to have it also inside us, not just something we read in a book in the Bible, but that we would learn it by heart. Okay, now we move on to this Torah, which is the other thing that Moses is writing down. And we see, as we saw before, and starting in verse 9, he writes this Torah, he gives it to the priests and who carry the ark. And later on, in verse 24, when Moses finished writing all the words of this Torah, the entire book, okay, he commanded the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant, okay, he says to them, take this book of the Torah and put it into the Ark of the Covenant. So whereas the poem is memorized and taught to the nation of Israel orally, the Torah is written down and placed in the Ark. And this is will then be in the temple. There will be a Torah scroll in the temple. And and what we have next in this part, starting in verse 10, after Moses writes this Torah and puts it aside, and when he's writing the Torah, we're assuming, and I think most people there's different interpretations, but the assumption, certainly I have, backed up by many commentators, is that he's writing the entire Torah. You know, we believe that the entire Torah, the 5 books of Moses, were dictated to Moses, and he wrote them down. So this is when he finished it. It's just before he dies. So he starts from Genesis 1, and he ends right here, okay? Right at these last verses, these last chapters of Deuteronomy, he completes it, he puts it aside. This is the final Torah scroll that is our Torah scroll to this day. It's been copied and passed on from generation to generation. Now, in that context, beginning in verse 10, we have another kind of an insert, a different commandment, suddenly a commandment that we're hearing about from the first time. And it says as follows: at the end of the 7-year cycle, at the end of the sabbatical year, on the holiday of Sukkot, of the Feast of Tabernacles, all of the nation will have come on Sukkot during the Feast of Tabernacles. It's one of the pilgrimage festivals. All the nation will gather. They will come to Jerusalem to bring their sacrifices to celebrate the holiday in Jerusalem. So at the conclusion of that holiday, there's once in 7 years, in other words, the holiday of Sukkot that completes the sabbatical year. Now, right now, yesterday, we celebrated Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and it began the sabbatical year. So this is a year, the sabbatical year is a year we don't plant and we don't plow, and we let the ground rest. A year from now, okay, we'll be able to start planting, etc. But the year begins with holidays. Nobody's doing a whole lot of planting during this holiday season. So you can picture the sabbatical years ended, and the farmers are all gathered. Maybe they put a few seeds in the ground between, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But if they had a long journey to travel to get to Jerusalem, they didn't have time to do that either. And they come to Jerusalem. This will be a year from now. And at that point, when they're there, God says, okay, we're going to gather everyone together. And Moses gives this commandment. And what do they do when they gather together? Gather, this is verse 12, gather the people, men, women, children, and the strangers in your communities, that they may hear, and so learn to revere the Lord your God, and to observe faithfully every word of his teaching, of this Torah. Their children too, who have not had the experience, shall hear and learn to revere the Lord your God as long as they live in the land you are about to cross the Jordan to possess. That is the source of what became known as Hakhel, gather. And indeed, the way this was done was that, again, at the conclusion of the sabbatical year, once in 7 years, at the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, all the nation would gather in Jerusalem, in the temple courtyards and the surrounding areas, and the king of Israel himself would read to the nation from the Torah. Now, what parts of the Torah would they read? Again, we don't have details here, but the Talmud tells us that the actual things that they would read were from selected verses, a great deal of selected verses and chapters from this book, the Book of Deuteronomy. And so when I read this, it's very interesting because on the one hand, in verse 9, it says Moses wrote the Torah, and we understand that to be from Genesis 1 to the end of Deuteronomy. And yet here, when it says in verse 12, and they should listen, they should learn and listen to do all the words of this Torah. Oh, in verse 11, even more. When all of Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God in the place that he will choose, you shall read this Torah aloud in the presence of all Israel. Okay? But in this case, this Torah in verse 11 was not understood to mean all of the 5 books of Moses. I guess for practical reasons, that would have been a little bit cumbersome to read everything at once, but only verses from Deuteronomy. Now, why Deuteronomy? I think Deuteronomy, what Deuteronomy actually means is as a second word or second Torah. It's a double. And what it is Moses really, it's his talk, and he's summarizing a lot of what has already been said. But most important, he is giving lessons to the nation that can be learned from the events that happened over the first 4 books of the Torah. And it's these lessons, and includes also the covenant. There is a second covenant that is partially entered into in the plains of Moab. We read this 2 weeks ago in Kitavo, and this covenant will then again be entered into as soon as they come into the land at Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. So that's also part of what's in Deuteronomy, and that's part of what is read. So in a sense, what you have every 7 years is a renewal of the covenant. When they talk about the importance of the Torah, and they talk about what they're learning, it also even here it talks about the importance of the covenant, that they must keep the covenant. The nation must keep the covenant. And in order to ensure that they do that, God is giving them as this commandment that they need to read this Torah, they need to recite it, and they have the special commandment to do it once in 7 years. Now, we don't really know very much from the Bible about how this was played out, but we do have 2 stories in the Bible that refer to a king gathering, or a leader gathering the nation to read from the Torah. In Nehemiah chapter 8, we have, and we know that it was actually on Rosh Hashanah when that happens, because we have the date. And there, then the Nehemiah reads out to the nation. I'll just read briefly. The entire people assembled as one man in the square before the water gate, and they asked Ezra the scribe to bring the scroll of the Torah of Moses, which the Lord had charged Israel. On the first day of the 7th month, Ezra the priest brought the Torah before the congregation, and men and women all who could listen with understanding. He read from it facing the square before the water gate from the first light until midday to the men and women and those who could understand. The ears of all the people were given to the scroll of the Torah. So here we have the leader, Ezra, as, in a sense, a renewal of the covenant that is going on here. This is at a time when the people have come back to Israel, and they are intermarried, and they've done all kinds of weird things. And this is a renewal of that covenant in order to, to bring alive again the observance of the commandments now that they have come back into the land. So we see that's a big part of what's going on there in the book of Nehemiah. But earlier than that, there's another situation that does not happen at this time of year. It happens, well, actually, we don't really know when it happens. The original date isn't given, but this is in 2 Kings with the king Josiah. 2 Kings chapter 22. This is a very interesting thing. He finds Josiah is a righteous king, but he's followed very, very horrible kings. Okay, and there's tremendous amount of idol worship and pagan worship in the land, and they've essentially forgotten the Torah. It has been destroyed and it has been forgotten. And so we have in 2 Kings verse 22, Josiah orders the cleaning out of the temple. And as part of that process, suddenly the priest finds a Torah scroll. And they don't even know what it is, and they don't know what's in it, and they're tremendously shocked. Initially, they read the Torah scroll. The priest reads it to Josiah, and as a result of this, Josiah has an entire revival where the entire nation comes to celebrate Passover. And it says they had never celebrated Passover like that since ancient times till that time. By the way, a very similar statement is made about Ezra's gathering, where they celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles just after the reading of the Torah, where it says there hadn't been a celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles since, early times until that day. So in both cases, we have a king or a leader of the nation reading from these Bible verses, connecting or initiating a revival, and they both are celebrating one of the pilgrimage festivals never in a way that had not been done in many, many, many years. Now, here in the case of Josiah, commentators and our Jewish tradition says he didn't find the entire Torah scroll. He found only the Book of Deuteronomy. And in fact, when he opened the Book of Deuteronomy, what the priest actually read to him were the blessings and the curses, the words of the covenant that we read a few weeks ago. And he was so taken aback and frightened when he heard these curses that he immediately was stimulated to start this whole revival. But I think what we see there, and indeed, if we go back to what I said before about the Hakel and the way Jewish tradition did it, they didn't read the whole Torah. They read only from the Book of Deuteronomy. And so clearly, this book, the Book of Deuteronomy, is seen in these various ways as a very central book to ensuring that the nation keeps the covenant. And it's a reminder, it is a way of awakening them if they have not kept the covenant. It's the entire Book of Deuteronomy, including the covenant, but not only the covenant. And I think that if we look at the entire Book of Deuteronomy and how much Moses is working so hard to try to convince the nation to keep loyal to God, to keep the commandments, not to stray to pagan gods, he's giving them these two vehicles. He's giving them the Torah scroll, and he's giving them the poem that we will read next week. And both of those are supposed to kind of guard them against this. He knows it won't work. He knows God tells him it's not going to work, but he's trying so hard. And he's saying, this is something that you will have. And the truth of the matter is, we can't say it didn't work. Okay. There was always sin, and there was always punishment, and there's always breaking the covenant. But the Book of Deuteronomy, and in fact, the entire Bible, remains with us to this very day. And when we are in a time when we don't know what God means and what messages he's sending, when we feel that we are in a time or in a place where God is hiding his countenance from us, we have the Bible that we can read, and we know that this is God's word to us. And we have the poem of chapter 32 that we can read, and we know that this is God's word to us. And so, and I think this is really the message I take from this one small, tiny little Torah portion. This is Moses' final attempt to give us what we need as we move on our journey. The portion begins with journey, walking, going, crossing, leading into battle. This is what will happen. This is what we're doing. This is what they will be doing. And the rest of the Torah portion tells us about the tools of the trade. God didn't give us, Moses didn't give us swords and weapons and strategic advice. He gave us two very important tools to take with us: the Torah scroll and the song, which of course is part of the Torah scroll, the song. And those things, the song that we will learn by heart and place on our hearts, and the Torah scroll that will be written, a written testimony that will be in the ark and will be with us forever. that's it. So if any of you want to unmute and say something, I'd love to hear it.
Sondra, I think it's interesting. Earlier on, a few chapters back, we talked about where it said when you all get a king, he will have to write a copy of the Torah,
Right.
presumably to keep it ever before him. And now we see where it's at least once every 7 years, it's kept before the people. I think it's kind of interesting how God wants his Torah to be alive and not packed away like it happened in the days preceding Josiah.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because one of when you read in the literature, what parts of Deuteronomy would they read? They all agree that they read that section where it talks about appointing a king and the fact that he has to write himself a Torah scroll and keep it with him. Actually, the word there is a Mishneh Torah, like a copy of the Torah, and that's another word that is also used for Deuteronomy, because it's like a repeat of the rest of the Torah, or a summary. So there is something special there also about the king, the relationship of the king to the book of Deuteronomy, and that's also something that is noted. I also think that it's very interesting, because if you think of take the image of the king coming before the nation. I don't think there's ever a situation in the ancient world where kings were all powerful, where a king came before the nation and then shared a commandment of someone else. Kings were seen as all powerful, and they shared their decrees. And even very often they didn't come before the people. They sent someone else to say, so says the king. Okay. And here, God is very clear. It is the king who needs to read the commandments of God. And also kind of puts a king in his place. He's not this autocratic, all-powerful king. He always has to do what God says, and he has to admit it to the people. He can't say, okay, I'll do what you say, God, but let's pretend, and the people think I'm the smart one, right? No, God wants to make sure the nation knows also who's really in charge here. Not this king, although he fills a very important role like Joshua. He has to go before the nation and take them to war, but he is with God's help. And the nation needs to always see the king is going to read from the Torah scroll.
I have a question about the Shemitah. Does the government have any influence? Is there a law, or is it all voluntary? And what percentage do you think actually let the land rest?
Well, that's a very complicated issue that today in a modern economy, keeping the Shemitah completely is very difficult to do. There are some farmers who do that, but the rabbinate is extremely involved in all of Israel. And they have, one of the things that they do is they have a sale of the land to non-Jews and then go forward and continue to farm the land. There are those who do other kinds of things of kind of being an employee of the court, and then the produce, not making profit on the produce. But it's a problematic situation, because today, if not just feeding the nation, but one of the issues of Shemitah is that you're not supposed to send your produce abroad. Okay, so if a nation doesn't send their produce abroad for 1 year, they will never send their produce abroad again. So there's a lot of complications, and I think it's something worth looking up if you're interested. But there is definitely, certainly, all the private gardens, everybody, nobody, tends their gardens. I mean, but it's not a law. This is all those people who are religious and who are following God's law. But the government itself is also involved in helping this along, no question. Anyway, so it was great to see you all here. And again, next week, we are meeting on Tuesday instead of on Thursday, because Thursday is Yom Kippur. So our regular class will meet on Tuesday, and that Tuesday we will complete the rest of Deuteronomy. That will be our last class of this series. And after that, we will be starting a new series on the Book of Joshua, and that will begin in October. And you will get information about that in your email. And don't forget, please spread this around, let people know about what we're doing. I'd be grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.